Hello, I'm Greg with Brownlow Writes, here with a cautionary tale. Sometimes the components that we buy are just not up to the standard that we prefer. And it's up to us as precision rifle shooters to discover these defects and learn how to either identify and call those particular defects or to do something about them in our process. And while some of these things we can fix, others are a complete non-starter. Once we discover them, there's no choice but to get rid of that particular component or that particular piece of equipment. Try to find some of these imperfections before they actually show up in your firing. Now, when I'm working with Wildcats, obviously this first fire-forming shot, that first round that I fire, is mostly designed to just get the case fully formed to my chamber. And so it's not really a big loss because I would never count on that ammunition to do anything. If you were to load Sami-Spec cartridges and you were to not discover something like this and you were using that first firing out of the brass to do something serious, then you might find this to be a very horrific chain of events that has taken place here. Now, obviously, a piece of brass that has a defect in it like this will shoot different than the others, and it, of course, certainly did. Folks, I was shooting on paper. That shot went quite a long ways from where the others did. And with good reason, obviously, the treatment that the bullet received when it was going in was different. I saw it show up on the amp press. We're constantly fighting against these components, folks. The components are always the limiting factor. It seems like the brass is at the root of most of it. But realistically, the brass and the bullets they're just kind of our Achilles heel in this. It's not very difficult to get a good barrel these days, so I wouldn't really consider the barrels to be one of our Achilles heels anymore. The bullets, we continue, I just get surprises all the time in my bullet. And it doesn't matter which manufacturer bullet I buy, there's just defects in the bullets. And then same thing goes with the brass, of course. This defective brass, it's not like it's just all segregated, separate. You're buying a defective piece of brass and you know you're doing it. It's always going to be a surprise. So this component issue, especially in the brass and in the bullets, is something that we're constantly having to fight against and run processes against to try to make sure that we can discover this stuff before it makes it to a live round that we actually care about, that we're going to be doing something important. Having a defect like this in a piece of brass that you used to load a round that you're about to shoot a trophy animal on a really expensive hunt with would be not a very good thing at all. I generally am very studious about that, but some of these defects, frankly, are so small that until you get a firing or 3 or 4 on them, you won't even see them. I've been working with brass that I had very dutifully went through. And it wasn't until firing number 3 that I even discovered that there was a problem in a particular piece of brass. And so unless you're sitting there with a very high-level magnification and measuring tools going over each individual piece of brass, it's still very likely that even with a good intent on your part, you might miss some of these defects. And so it is very good to continue to look for them firing to firing as you work with your brass and as you continue to load your brass multiple times. Each firing and each step during the process, try to run your fingernail over a couple of spots that some of these errors and defects in the brass are very commonly found. We're handling the brass a lot if we're doing it as a high-level precision rifle shooter that's using manual one-to-one operations to do this stuff. So we're resizing it, we're annealing it, we're trimming it, there's a number of different opportunities that we get to handle it and to inspect it closely. If you think because all of your brass came out of the same box that it's the same, you would be mistaken. This is a split neck. Here's an up-close look at that, and you can see here that the neck is just completely torn from the top of it to the bottom of it. And this is something that you'll run into from time to time, and there isn't really anything that you can do to prevent it. In this particular instance, I am fire-forming 22 PRC Primal. The 22 PRC Primal starts off with a Lapua 6.5 PRC case. And I've turned this brass to 12.5 thousandths of neck thickness. And then through a series of steps, I resize the brass down to 22 caliber. As you can see here, some of the neck material becomes shoulder material. Generally speaking, if the pieces of brass are all the same, then when they get subjected to the same treatments, they will all react the same. So let's take a look at what the final fire form looks like here. It's not a very dramatic form. You can see it's mostly just a shoulder angle change. And there's some other finer points, but that's the gist of it. How exactly can we know whether it is L'Aqua at fault here or whether it's something in my process? That's a very excellent question, because a lot of shooters out there have no earthly idea on how to properly vet their systems. So they don't know whether or not it's something they're doing or whether it's just a faulty component. One easy way to start, and this is something that all of you will have access to, is to simply measure some of your cases. The first measurement we want to take is a measurement on the outside diameter of one of our loaded rounds on the neck. So with a bullet seated in your brass, you would measure outside to outside on the neck. That gives you the diameter that you're working with on your loaded rounds. Next thing, you would measure a fired case. So you'd fire that case in your rifle, and then you'd measure in the same location on the outside of the neck. This will tell you how much the neck is expanding from your loaded round diameter, and you can detect any drastic problems in your chamber or the components themselves. Obviously, if the chamber is too large, then no brass in the world is going to be able to hold up to such a large diameter change. Well, how much is too much? The old think on this topic is pretty basic, because back in the day, everybody wanted a really tight fitment here, and they thought that that was key to maintaining accuracy and precision. We've learned today that that is just not really true. We can have actually a pretty large fitment here in the neck, and things will still shoot very admirably. The other thing is that if it's too tight here, you can have some bullet release problems, especially in later firings. Now, what we're going for here is enough clearance to allow the brass to expand and have the bullet leave without being interfered with. If the dimension is too tight, then you can actually have a situation where the brass doesn't expand enough, and parts of the brass can drag on the bullet and create a very dangerous pressure situation. So you don't want a very tight interference here. This is something where you should have a pretty open tolerance, where you have room for this brass to grow. Well, what is the correct number? Well, I like to have a minimum of roughly 5/1000ths of space. If I'm measuring 5/1000ths, then it's probably closer to actually 6/1000ths. Now, your chamber is actually larger than what you're going to be measuring, and this is due to the fact that your brass will spring back. It'll fire during the firing event, it will expand and fill the chamber, and then afterwards it will spring back and contract a little bit. So the measurement that you're taking is actually indicative of the brass being a little bit smaller than the actual chamber itself. And this is especially true if you can just take that brass, chamber it right back in your rifle and not feel any resistance in the neck area. That will give you positive confirmation that your brass that you're measuring is actually smaller than the diameter of the neck of your chamber. Remember, we're dealing with a diameter of a cylindrical object here. The neck is basically just a cylinder. And when we're talking about overall dimensions, the diameter from one side to the other, there is two sides to the brass. And so you've got brass thickness on both sides that is moving outward during the firing event. So if you're only measuring 5/1000ths, folks, that's only 2.5 thousandths per side. So I would consider that to be right on the minimum end of what you would want. We're getting pretty deep in the weeds here in a very complex discussion about the front end of a chamber and how it's designed and how it interacts with the throat of the rifling. So we'll save that for some different content in the future. But for now, suffice it to say, you want this tolerance to be wide enough to allow that bullet to exit very simply. And you don't want a potential of a neck wall thickness variance or run out or coaxial alignment issue between your bullet to be creating any issues here. So now this is where my thoughts on this subject, just like the discussion about how we're supposed to be sizing our brass, what diameter of expanders and what dimension and diameter of the bushings we're supposed to be using differ from industry standard. This discussion also differs in the sense that I've had rifles that had a variance here measured probably in the neighborhood of 12 to 14 thousandths. So let's just say, 6+ thousandths per side of movement here on the brass. And for a lot of people, that would be crazy. They couldn't possibly envision shooting something like that. But I have had fantastic success with it in the past, and there is some benefits to it in terms of how we're able to tune these rifles and whether or not we can get the kind of consistency we want in field conditions. But I would really kind of consider that probably the top end. There is a point where even the best brass in the world will not be able to tolerate how much movement you're demanding of it. And we want to be very careful to stay away from that. So if I was looking for an average here, I would say that somewhere between 6 and 10 thousandths of total diameter difference between your loaded rounds and your fired brass would be a pretty good place to be. So in this way, by measuring these things, you can somewhat proof your system to make sure that you're not actually asking too much of your brass. Now, obviously, your sizing die has some play in this, because if you're doing too much on the sizing side and you're not annealing properly, then you could be really demanding a lot because the brass is moving too much when you're inserting your bullet and you're expanding it, contracting it overly on the sizing side. And that's going to put a lot of hardness, or it's going to make the brass brittle because you're doing too much to it on the sizing side, and then subsequently bullet seating, you could potentially overwork it there. Now, if you're following the prescribed method that I have laid out in previous videos, then you should not be running afoul of that situation. But mathematically, just by looking at the diameters of your various implements, you can make sure that that is also not a problem. Now, the next way requires you to be somewhere where you can reload at the bench, the way that I do here, where I can just hop over here on the bench, load a round, slide across the room, fire the thing. And if you really want to know what's going on with your brass at your particular loads and everything that's actually going on and whether your brass can take what you're asking of it, the best and only real way to discover that is through live fire. And so, as I've laid out in my previous videos, what you would do is take a single piece of brass and you would load it, shoot it, and then you'd cycle it through and load it and shoot it again, that same exact piece of brass. Now, by doing this, you'll find out a ton of information. As our previous videos mentioned, you can find out whether the brass can even really tolerate for the long term the kind of pressures that you're subjecting it to. But in this particular instance, what we're looking for is how many firings can we get without annealing before we would have some sort of a failure in our neck. Now, so that's exactly what I did here, because I wanted to show you guys the difference between a component failure or something that's a failure of the user. So I intentionally subjected a single case to multiple firings to try to figure out where I could get this neck to fracture, where I could get the neck to do a split neck the way that we saw on firing number 1 of this other case. So I grabbed a single case and I fired it 26 times. That's how many times it took before I was able to create a split neck in this case. Now, let's keep in mind, this is from the exact same box, same lot number and same box of brass that the brass that failed in one firing came from. So there's no difference here, and I took the exact same brass and I just fired it over and over again. I did not anneal it because I wanted to see just how good the brass was. On your screen here, you see 2 pieces of brass. On the left, you see the case that I did not anneal and I fired 26 times. On the 26th firing, the case had a split neck. Now you can see the characteristics of a split neck that happen as a result of this kind of treatment and overworking. Because without annealing, I was not able to bring this brass in the neck back to neutral for each firing. It just kept getting harder and harder and more brittle, and then every subsequent cycle just made that worse until the one area of the neck fractured. Now you can see here, it actually just cracked, and it's a very jagged very harsh looking crack. And the nature of how this thing cracked, you'll notice everything's kind of bent outward and it's blown outward and it's very jagged and it's very sharp. Now look in comparison to what you see on the other piece of brass, the one that failed on firing number 1, literally the fire forming load. So it was not even a hot charge. It was just a very normal fire forming load, and it fractured on number 1. So you'll notice how the ends of this split neck are kind of turned inward. Yeah, so that's pretty typical of what we see when you have a split neck as a function of a brass defect. Here, obviously, there was a crease in the neck of this brass that went from the top of the mouth all the way down to the shoulder. And when I fired it, it blew that crease out. The brass had no ability to flex and move the way that the brass is supposed to do, because when they creased it there, it made the brass extremely hard. When you bend at a very sharp angle and beat brass down like that, it will remove, it'll just instantly harden it. It will make it very, very hard. And the sharper you turn it and the more force you subject it to, it will make it so hard and brittle that, as you can see, it will not be able to withstand even one firing. So the nature of how these two look sitting right side by side, you can tell that there's a very specific difference here. Now, on the one hand, my case, which was fired 26 times, and just so you know that I actually did this, look at the case itself. You can see how there's little dings all over the place. Those dings happen during, on the shoulder specifically, those dings happen during extraction and ejection. When the case is being dragged out of the chamber, it will land against the interior front band of the front band of the action where the ejection port is. It'll get dinged against that, and then when you pull it out, it'll oftentimes kind of bounce along the kind of corner of the front of the ejection port inside the front band there. And then when you eject it all the way, sometimes it'll come out and it'll be flinging and rotating, and it'll bang into other things, other parts of the rifle, or maybe the scope or something you've got sitting next to the rifle. So cases that have been fired quite a lot, you can very easily see that that's the case because they've been dinged up. Now, I'll show the bottom of the case here too. Here is the case that's been fired 26 times. And here is the case brand new, where it's been fired one time, essentially. So this case that had been fired one time, this is what it looks like. And you can kind of see a little bit of false positive there of the ejector ring. And that's just because this rifle is very new and hasn't been fired that much. And the ejector plunger hole has a little bit of sharpness around it that I could probably just go and stone off really quick. But there's just a little bit of false positive there. You can see an indication that it's been fired. In comparison, the case that's been fired 26 times, that one is beat flat. Now, anyone that's fired a case a lot of times before, you'll know that this case has been subjected to a great many firings, because it is the base of the case is basically beat flat. The head stamp and everything is very sharp, and there's geography and dings and marks from the extractor all over the place on the bottom of this case. So here we've proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that this particular batch of brass and the dimensions and the work, the expectation that I'm subjecting it to is perfectly fine. For one brass to be able to be fired at some relatively decent, I mean, there was full operating loads on this thing. I was running 53 grains of H4831 shortcut, and I was launching an 85.5 Berger in excess of 3,400 foot per second. So this isn't a mild charge. And I did experience a little bit of plastic deformation of the case web about firing number 22. So the case itself was starting to give way. I could have reduced the pressure of the load a little bit, and it would have postponed that case web expansion. But realistically, it would have made no difference, because even at a low charge where I was nowhere near operating pressure, the split neck would still happen. And this is something that I've seen many times throughout my career. So this is a couple of ways that you can find out whether or not only your system is correct, whether the expectations that you have are aligned properly, But this will give you the opportunity to look at your total ecosystem as a whole. Not just, is this component bad, but am I doing all of the right things? Now, my previous content on this, where I think the video was called, Are They Making Bad Brass?, where I talk in detail about how to objectively look at your brass and see whether or not it is of good quality or not. And so there's more information about that in that video. I encourage you to check it out. But in this topic, you can see how this split neck would have happened no matter what. For it to happen on firing number 1 when a piece of brass from the exact same lot number did not have any split necks. And of course, there's over 100 pieces in this batch that I ran that I have fire formed, and none of them had a split neck. Just this one had a split neck. And then when I grab a piece of brass and subject it to 25 firings, it doesn't have any issues. Now, granted, by firing number 22, I could kind of see that little divot forming there, and I could tell that that's where our split neck was going to occur. We obviously are uncovering a weak point in the brass. And, that will happen differently. Really, I don't see that very often. Most of the time when the brass fails, it just fails. And you will see no real indication of a split neck until you have a split neck. But this was a unique opportunity to document that for you guys, so I took it. Now you can see how extremely faint some of these little imperfections can be. Here is a crease on a shoulder of a different case. Well, this isn't 6.5 PRC, but this crease is very typical of what you would see in imperfection that would cause this kind of split neck, especially if it carried up into the neck of the brass. So I've just kind of scribbled. I just scribbled the Sharpie there so you guys can see what that looks like. But it is, in some cases, very faint. And so you really have to look for it in order to find it. The overarching theme here is that brass is a very limiting factor in our shooting. Now, Lapua has long established itself as one of the leaders in the brass industry, so much so that I used almost exclusively Lapua for a very long time. Then Alpha Munitions came on the scene, and I began using that exclusively. When Alpha Munitions comes out with a 6.5 PRC based thing that I can run all of these different Wildcats of mine, all of the PRC primals, well then I will switch to Alpha because I typically don't have as many problems with it as I do any other brass manufacturer. But Lapua, historically speaking, is one of the titans in the industry. They have been the standard that every other brass manufacturer has been judged by, but it doesn't insulate them where if they don't pay attention on a particular batch of brass. Now, this particular batch, I've been plagued with creased necks and creased shoulders in this thing. Now, I only had 1 out of 100 here, but the previous 100 that I did, I had like 5 out of that batch of 100 that had this exact same thing happen. I've had 6BR batches of brass and 6BR that did the exact same thing, creased necks and creased shoulders. So, point of fact, this issue, as far as defects that I found with Lapua cases, is the number 1 problem that they have. I don't find much in the way of defects that aren't a creasing of some kind. So it is a very difficult thing for them to root out, obviously. I have no doubt that they don't want to be putting brass out there that has this kind of defect in it. However, the brass as a whole still shoots very, very good. It's just once you root out these particular pieces that are having these issues, that have these defects, then the rest of the batch shoots fantastic. And so it's just an accident that happens during the forming process. And, they are just running their machines a little too hard, or they've got a out of spec something somewhere. They're not taking as many steps to do the forming as maybe they should. And so they end up with problems. Or maybe their QC needs to be improved. I don't know. But what I do know for sure in this particular instance is that there's definitely not anything in my system, and it's not anything about the methodology that I'm employing here or the equipment that I'm using. This was very simply a faulty piece of brass with a crease in the neck. Hopefully this content will help some of you avoid jumping to any false conclusions about your process if you were to run into this issue in the future. You should approach the situation with a very methodical mindset and just look at it from very matter-of-factly. Take your proper measurements to make sure that you're doing everything as correctly as you can, and make sure that your chamber is up to spec, that your die is up to spec. And then you grab a piece of brass and subject it to a whole bunch of firings. And if that good brass does not exhibit any of the same defects or errors that the one did, well, then you know you're probably just dealing with a bad component. Conversely, if you're having multiple problems creep up throughout the entire batch of brass, then but your dimensions check out, you could be dealing with an entire batch of brass that is bad. Now, since this video is a cautionary tale, and I think it's only fitting that our scripture reading today give a little bit of a cautionary tale as well. So I'll read to you now from Romans 1:18. But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Let that serve as a cautionary tale to you all, that if you do not know God today, you have no justification for not knowing him. And I would encourage you to start reading some scripture and start just opening a Bible every once in a while and start getting to know God, because his word is how you get to know him. His word is how you nourish your soul and your connection with the Spirit. So just how you should be inspecting your brass for defects, you should be inspecting yourself for defects. And as you find them, you should try to eliminate those defects, using the power of the word to do so. And there's no justification. There's no excuse. There's no reality where it's perfectly okay and acceptable for your defects to continue to cloud the presentation of the truth in your life. And God being truth, if you do not know him, you do not know truth.